Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ailey Kennedy. I am one of the lead researchers on the Future of Aid 2040 project. And I'm really thrilled and very grateful to the START Network for having me here this morning to build on Sanj and Christina's really excellent introduction in setting the stage for the virtual assembly. I think one of the things that really resonated with what Sanj and Christina were outlining were not just the scale of the challenges that we are facing as a sector, but also the fact that even before the more acute challenges which we have been facing this year in terms of funding and structure, there was already a wide recognition building on last year's and in the years before on the need for deep change within the humanitarian system. And so this is one of the things that we want to really draw out and have a conversation with. And we hope that this project of the Future of Aid in 2040 can be part of that discussion and help to provide a platform and a forum to think collectively about where we want to go. Many of you will already have participated in the Future of Aid 2040 project. And so today what I'm going to be doing is to do a bit of a presentation on the outputs of that area of research. And also we're going to be having some engagement through Slido and inviting you all to share and join in the sort of a bit of a sense check and reflection on what this means. So with that note, I will encourage you all to join us on Slido. You can scan using the QR code here on the screen, or alternatively, if you would rather use your laptop, you can go to slido.com and use the meeting code START2040. You'll be able to log on at any time and start participating. So please do. It would be very interesting to hear from everyone your reflections on what we're going to present today. I will try and keep the presentation with, though there's a lot of information, relatively short to ensure that we also have time for questions and answers in the end. And I think you can use either the Slido platform or presumably the Zoom chat as well would also function for that too. So with that, I just want to start by saying one of the things that makes the Future of Aid project both so interesting and such a privilege to get to lead, and also so interesting, I think, in terms of the outputs, is the level of community that we're involved in building it. Starting with our steering committee, of which the START Network is a member, along with other local, international aid organizations. They're both some more focused on academics and research, some more operational. Some are funders, some are implementers. And we are very grateful to the steering committee because one of the things that we have found to be most useful as part of this progress is hearing from people and organizations for what are the questions they're truly facing, what kind of information they feel they want and need in order to be able to take decisions in this time of heightened uncertainty. And I think this has really ensured that the outputs of the Future of Aid 2040 project are useful. The members of the steering committee are just one cohort and one grouping really of the organizations who have participated. There were many more people in addition to the organizations represented on the slide here who have joined us to not just to participate in the consultations that we have run. There are nearly 900 people who participated in phase 1 of the Future of Aid study. The participants were predominantly from Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia. 54% were male and 44% female. Really crucially, and one of the things that has been incredibly useful for us is that we had an amazing approximately 40% of respondents with lived experience of crises. And understanding this has allowed us to really focus in on the information that they have shared and really be able to ensure that we're all benefiting from their experience and what they have highlighted in terms of changes that they want to see, how they see and receive aid, and the things that they have lived within their communities. The largest cohort of participants worked for local national NGOs or CBOs and other local movements. And that also provides us with, as we know, a really critical injection of information and insight from organizations who are not necessarily always included in global research projects such as this one. Really, the foundation of this study is the input that we have gathered from these nearly 900 people. There is very little of the analysis in the report. In fact, I don't believe there is any that came through and was published without it first being gathered from the community and then reported back to the community, validated by the participants before we moved on to the next phase. And this iterative way of building the research has allowed us to really profile and mainstream the voices of the community in the research that we're hoping to summarize for you today. We began this process by asking people to think a little bit about where they saw the aid system in 2025. And we wanted to do this in a way that unpacked and delved in as deeply as possible into the questions that people had around the ways in which they see the aid sector, not just in terms of what's in the headlines or even the drivers of change that they think sit underneath it, but even deeper still, asking people what are some of the perspectives and beliefs that they think underpin the international aid sector, and thinking about what are some of these worldviews and how they shape the systems that we see every day. When we asked the community to reflect on this question, we had many and quite very different answers. And I think that underpins our collective understanding that we don't necessarily have one humanitarian system, but rather multiple humanitarian systems that sit underneath this broad umbrella. So some of the things that came through very strongly was that the perspectives and worldviews still underpinning the international aid system were focused very much on colonialism, white saviorism, and the imbalance of power that still exists between actors within the system as well as different actors in the communities themselves. The idea that the international aid system is implemented within a broader framework of capitalism and inequality, and the impacts that that has in terms of driving structural vulnerabilities. When priorities around aid are taken from a geopolitical lens opposed to a focus on sustainable development, there was a reflection that building from these two different worldviews could result in a system that was often in conflict. We had many people listing and discussing humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law, but the perspectives on these were quite varied. Some were really harkening back to the fact that we needed to revisit, reinvigorate, and sort of refocus on humanitarian principles, that the application of humanitarian law must be something which we never accept being broken. And others were more focused on the idea that they felt that sometimes the principles were not always either applied or applicable to the context in which they were working, that humanitarian principles needed to be more varied and diverse, and that international humanitarian law had shown itself to be ineffective in protecting communities in need. So even within that particular theme, there was some disagreement around which direction people felt the aid sector was going. However, one thing that was clear and very consistent was that people focused very concretely on the ideas of solidarity and humanity, of these being key to the ethos and morals of humanitarian actors within the space, and that community lead on community needs. And by that, we mean the preeminence of communities in understanding what they really want and what they need in order to build lives of dignity. We think, given the great diversity of perspectives and beliefs and worldviews that people outlined here, and the language that they use to describe them, that it's clear that the sector is undergoing a shift, that there's been a real challenge and a reevaluation of the dominant paradigm of aid. And a lot of this data was actually gathered prior to the big close within USAID and sort of the funding crisis that has precipitated a lot of these thoughts. So I think what that outlines to us is that this particular framework in terms of a rethink and a reevaluation predated the financial situation in which the sector is now in. And I think as a result, that speaks again to what Christina was outlining, that even in the assembly last year, there was change and notice that this idea that a deep change and a transformation was required within the sector. We also asked people to go one level deeper in thinking about humanitarian assistance and aid, and provoke them to think not just in terms of and from an analytical lens, but also from an emotional one. And we focused in on the participants who, with lived experience of crises, to ask them what stories and narratives they would use to describe aid. The stories that they shared came in three distinct areas, really. One was overwhelm, another was an us versus them dynamic, and the third was around hope through collective action. I've highlighted here just three of the many stories that we gathered, which we think sort of typify these different themes. From a colleague in Kenya, we had, I'll never be able to reach the horizon. It's a never-ending march. We help one person to improve the situation and the need only increases. We felt this quote really is a key example of the overwhelm category of stories from which we had a great many. As Christina and Sanj both outlined as well, we are living in a time at the moment where, as resources are rapidly declining, need is also dramatically increasing. Within the us versus them dynamic, these narratives really touched and built on the worldview perspectives around colonialism, white saviorism, and imbalances of power that exist within the system. And a colleague from the Philippines outlined that international aid feels like a thief leaving some coins for the victim to buy food. There were many of these stories, and I think hearing it in the words of people who are affected by crisis is very arresting for us within the international aid system, and it behooves us really to listen. In one of the presentations which we have recently done on the future of aid, a colleague outlined how when she was reading the report, her first instinct was to become quite defensive as to reading some of the language that was shared by people affected by crises and by colleagues in local organizations. She works for an intermediate actor. And I think that was a really honest reflection. But what she also did was she mentioned that she sat a little bit more with the findings and with the words that they were sharing and moved into a space where she was more able to listen and understand what they're trying to communicate, which is critically important if we're able to collectively move forward and design a system which serves communities in a just and fair way. The final area and theme that we have through the stories that we gathered is hope through collective action. And these stories really outlined the centrality of community and the way that aid itself can provide a lifeline. Some of the imagery that was used, as you can see here from this story from a colleague in Lebanon, is a lifeline, a rope thrown carefully across a river, connecting a stranded community to a source of safety, resources, and hope. The lifeline may take different forms of food, water, shelter, or medical care, but its primary role is to keep people from drowning, to give them a chance to survive long enough to rebuild their lives. A lot of the imagery that came through from this was both a rope, was a bridge, a lighthouse, a beacon, a way in which aid can provide communities in sometimes the most dire situations with hope and with a connection and solace and resources to be able to rebuild their own lives. I want to take a pause here and ask for a point of reflection from you all as the START community who's joining us here today. On Slido, we want to hear from you. Which of these stories or themes resonate most with you in how you see aid in 2025? Again, you can join at slido.com using the meeting code, or you should be able to scan the QR code that's currently on the screen to be able to access. So I think it's very heartening, particularly at the start of a conference, and thinking about ways forward. That hope through collective action is what's resonating most strongly with everyone here in the community. So that is excellent to hear, and I think starts this session off on the right tone. So what we did after talking to the communities and really hearing from people about where they saw aid sitting within the space and the sector itself, what we started to excuse me, discuss was where they saw the aid sector in terms of how it was moving forward. 2040 can feel like a long time away, especially when we're living currently through such a volatile period. But in reality, if we want to use Christina's phrase, to be able to leverage deep change and transformation within the system and the sector, those kind of changes, particularly cultural, take a very long time. And quite a few of these transformations require significant investments. And so the 2040 time horizon will be here before we know it. And if our goal is to really have a transformed aid system which puts communities at the center of decision making and resourcing and empowers them within these spaces, it's critically important for us to be making those investments today, even as we're managing the disruption from the volatility in our sector at the moment. So what we did is we asked the community to build from their understanding of where we were today and to identify drivers of change between now and 2040. They first came up with a long list of drivers, and we consolidated those using some of the frameworks that they developed through the causal layered analysis of 2025 to create 25 different drivers of change. We then took those back to the community for validation and asked them to vote on which ones they felt were the most important and uncertain. And that is what has yielded our scenario drivers for the 2040 study. We broke down the drivers into two different groups. The first was external drivers, and these focused on what would be the drivers of change in our global environment. As you can see here, there are about 17 different drivers that were outlined here. If you can't read the screen, please do go to the website where you can look at all of this in more detail in your own time. But they ranged from food systems and agriculture, populism and nationalism, education and access, inequality, across a very wide spectrum of different drivers that were changing the environment of the people who contributed to the study itself. But three came out as what they thought were the most important and uncertain drivers. The first was climate change and water scarcity. The second was migration and displacement. And the third were geopolitical shifts and power realignment. So these three drivers that were defined and selected by the community became the concentration of this framework for the scenarios that we have looked at between now and 2040. But to complement this understanding of how the world around us was changing, we also wanted to explore what are the potential shifting dynamics within the aid sector itself. And there were 9 drivers of change that were identified here, including public opinion, the humanitarian workforce and aid worker well-being, accountability and transparency, aid system initiatives, among many others. But there were 2 here that stood out very strongly as the most important and uncertain. The first was the power shift and localization, and the second was on humanitarian funding and donor dynamics. So using this understanding of the drivers and the way in which the community sees both the world around us changing as well as the aid sector itself, we began to build a framework for a set of 2040 scenarios. These took into consideration these drivers, which people felt were the most important and uncertain, but also those which people felt were heavy trends, things that were going to remain consistent across the outlook. And those heavy trends really focused around the increasing impacts of the climate emergency, the fact that we're moving into the retreat of multilateralism and a rise of a regional and bloc world, the continued use of information and disinformation as part of society and disruption, and the regionalization of aid. So using these heavy trends and the uncertainties from the community, we have built a structure of a set of scenarios which are outlined here. So here you can see on the vertical axis, we have what we call multipolar blocks at the top. This is one hypothesis of how the external environment may shift and change. When we are looking at scenarios in a multi-block world, we're looking at a divided world with limited cooperation, where responses to conflict, migration, and climate change may differ. Here, there are regional blockings and regional groupings coming to the fore, but there is still cooperation that exists between them, albeit on a more limited scale than we have seen in previous decades. On the other side of the global environment, we have constructed a hypothesis that's called empires and conflict. Here we're looking at a fragmented world where major world powers tend to rival empires, there's strong borderization and militarization, and very limited international cooperation, increased displacement and conflict amid worsening environmental degradation, and limited investments to support communities suffering through those vulnerabilities. So these are the 2 axes that were identified in terms of unpacking how the global system itself could evolve. On the horizontal axis, you can see the hypotheses which are defining the way in which the aid system might change. On the left, we have network cooperation, a space where new alliances and novel forms of aid and innovative funding models may emerge. This is different ways in which aid actors can work together. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what's called survival of the fittest, a collapse of the aid system into fragmented and highly localized interventions, where INGOs disappear or are paralyzed by the context in which they are working. Before I go into detail in each of these 4 scenarios, I just want to outline a couple of things which are crucially important when considering foresight and scenario work in general. The purpose of these 4 scenarios is not necessarily to give you one truth of what 2040 might look like, but rather to improve our understanding of how the context in which we are living and working might evolve over the time period. So it's necessary to consider all 4 scenarios at once. We may find that in different areas of the world, different scenarios exist at the same time. As we know, the geographic spectrum, which is covered by the START network and the aid sector in general, is very vast. And the contexts, even today, are different, and they are likely to continue to be different in different regions and countries across the full spectrum of the time period. Equally, many contexts shift and change over time. So you might find one context which sits more comfortably within a particular scenario today in 2025, but by 2040 may have moved into a different kind of future. And that's another reason why scenarios and scenario planning itself can be a very useful tool, because it allows us to think about adaptability and how well we can work across different kinds of futures, how well we can manage changes in context while continuing to strive for our missions and achieve impact for the communities that we serve. So none of the scenarios I present today are intended to be the one sole truth of where we are in 2040, but rather to be used as a tool for us to think about and unpack how we could work differently in each of these different contexts. Our first scenario that we're going to explore, Aid on Many Paths, looks at a multi-block world where it's divided into regional spaces, but there is still international cooperation that exists. And it's also looking at, from the aid system side, at the future within the networked cooperation, a structure where new alliances and new forms of aid have emerged. One of the things we did is we used the stories that were shared by people affected by crises as part of the causal layered analysis to essentially be an anchor for the scenarios, to speak in the words of people with lived experience, to describe a little bit what these futures might look like. And here we have a colleague from Indonesia who's outlined how each termite has a special task without declaring itself the most deserving, both in normal conditions and when a crisis threatens the colony. And we felt this story was quite evocative of what we were trying to communicate with the Aid on Many Paths scenario. Because here, in this future, what we're looking at is a world of structured regional alliances where there's a diverse approaches to aid and new forms of governance are all accepted and are effective because of their collaboration in design. Aid aligns with the culture of regional blocs and is built from the context of regional politics and economic dynamics. Local actors take a lead in response, while intermediary actors step back, providing financing, technical support, and advocacy. New funding streams and economic models emerge, blending religious networks, private foundations, income, and regional alliances to structure an aid system where it is essentially, as this story describes, many different termites, each with their own value proposition within the sector to serve communities effectively, working together, none attempting to be the most deserving or the most important, but rather creating a networked approach to being able to meet the needs of the people around them. So one of the exercises that we want to go through today is to prompt you to think a little bit about these futures. So when we think about working in an Aid on Many Paths scenario, what for you would be the most critical areas of innovation that you need to invest in order to be effective in this future? We have outlined 8 different options here of different spaces, different sort of capacities within the aid sector where we think that there is space to invest in innovations and taking things forward and making it a priority, essentially. And we wanted to hear from you on which of these you think will be most critical. You'll be able to choose 3 within this particular future. So you can have a look through the list and assess a little bit. If you're working on this Aid on Many Paths scenario, which of these do you think would be most important? Okay, so we have a few different things coming through strongly here. So at the top of the list, still financing and resource flows. So innovations in funding models, pooled resources, direct access, and flexible funding, followed by pretty much equally resilience capacity and partnership models. So I think what this speaks to a little bit is the idea that in an Aid on Many Paths scenario where there are these new and different networks emerging, different ways of connecting with actors and communities across the space, and really building and leveraging the diversity within the aid system, that there will need to be investments in thinking about how resources flow through that type of structure and network, what different paths and avenues there are to take advantage of, and how partnership models and building resilience can be maintained within that frame. I'm going to move us on to the next scenario now, and we're going to do this question with each one, because one of the things that we are finding interesting is that as we're sort of understanding how people are seeing themselves and their organizations in these futures, there has been in previous sessions a different prioritization within each scenario for which with the levers of innovation people think will be most critical. So here on our second scenario, it's called Patchwork Solidarities. The story guiding this one outlines how aid is like a patchwork quilt, hastily stitched together with different fabrics, each representing various organizations, communities, and responses. While some are well-worn and fraying, others are bright and new, funded by global institutions and promising innovation. But critically, sometimes they do not all fit seamlessly into the whole. In Patchwork Solidarities, we're still in a global future, which is defined by this multi-block world where there's limited but some international cooperation around transnational issues. But opposed to being in the networked cooperation side of the aid sector scenarios, we're now looking at an aid sector that's defined by survival of the fittest, with a collapsed humanitarian system into fragmented and ad hoc and highly localized interventions. In the Patchwork Solidarities, we have a world of varied levels of regional cooperation. And critically, aid is defined by the do-it-yourself solidarity, driven by self-help networks, members of the diaspora, critically local faith-based organizations, and episodes of mutual aid, which we see existing even in the crises, even in the most forgotten crises. Responses are agile, context-specific, and rooted in local ownership. Aid is largely transactional in the short term, but it enables adaptive and innovative solutions tailored to each crisis. It's more improvisational, shaped by shifting alliances rather than global governance. And here, critically, for some on this call, intermediary actors have limited and inconsistent levels of influence. The ability of intermediary actors from the international side varies hugely, whether or not on the basis of whether or not local organizations and aid ecosystems are interested in having that international support. So in this future, what we're really looking at is the do-it-yourself solidarity driven by local networks themselves, with a very limited, if any, global structure behind it. So in this kind of future, what would be the 3 areas of innovation that you think would be most critical for succeeding? So here, unlike in the aid on many paths scenario, there isn't global collaboration or cooperation, and there isn't so much of a space and a role for that within that framework. So where would you think you needed to invest in terms of priorities? Okay, so here we have financing and funding flows still at the top. We had advocacy higher up for a minute, but it looks like it's actually going to be very similar to the aid on many path responses in terms of financing and resource flows, resilience and capacity and partnership models. But advocacy and systemic reform, I think, are where we're pushing further up to the top than on the previous one. So when we consider our next scenario, we're going to be moving away from the multi-blocks world towards the empires and conflict structure within the scenario. So this is looking at a much more contested environment. When we are looking at our scenario called Empires of Aid, we're focusing on a future where the world is fully fragmented into rival empires with strict borders and military buildup, conflict resources and environmental degradation increasing and displacement being widespread. So that's the global environment that we're looking at, a much more contentious and fractured space. But we wanted to consider what networked cooperation might look like under this type of future, where new alliances of aid may emerge. When we asked, when we were looking for a story to think about what would describe this scenario, a colleague from the Democratic Republic of Congo had shared a vision where a person who gives and takes back in another way. So this idea of aid being very much transactional. In this future, we're looking at a scenario where aid becomes a core instrument of geopolitical competition, fully serving state interests. Major powers like the US and China use aid as a tool of influence, shaping global narratives and strategic alliances. The UN is completely sidelined. Local NGOs operate within strict political constraints, some fully aligned with state agendas, while INGOs act as agents of empire, and others struggle to maintain even limited autonomy. Aid is not neutral, it is a tool of power projection. Here we're looking at a scenario in a future where the types of networks, the new networks and the new alliances which we're exploring are very different from the aid on many paths scenario, which we looked at first. Rather than being structured and locally grown and organic within the regions, here we're looking at networks which are structured along the political axes of different major powers within the world and how they can be leveraged for their own geopolitical gain. This is potentially, and some of the reactions we've had, has been one of the most difficult scenarios to consider how you could work in and work effectively. Obviously, within this framework, there are significant challenges in terms of how aid could be delivered in a principled way, whether or not aligning with the agendas of major global powers who are using aid as a tool for their own power projection in as forthright and clear a way as it's outlined here, whether or not it's possible to deliver international aid in a way that organizations would be comfortable doing that. We explore a little bit in this scenario the ways in which aid itself might go underground in terms of looking at different ways of using sort of more off-book platforms and the dark web to communicate and to send more sort of aid and resources through some of these other channels. But it would be a very challenging question, I think, for many organizations and networks. There might be very different opinions on the way in which you would approach a question such as this in terms of who it is worth working with and how you do so in a principled fashion and what principles apply. So here we have a different reflection on the areas of innovation to put forward. The first one being resilience and capacity, innovations that strengthen local resilience and social capital, organizational adaptability and innovation incubation. Legitimacy and trust being a primary one. And I think program design and delivery, as well as advocacy and systemic reform, like to be equal here within this future. In our final scenario, what we call the Great Unraveling, we're looking at a future which is still within the empires and conflict global environment, but looks at the survival of the fittest in terms of how the humanitarian aid structure may have collapsed, providing a plate of food for an entire camp of hungry refugees. It was a way in which we thought we could capture this story as shared by a colleague from El Salvador. Here it is a world of chaos and closed borders where states prioritize isolation and state preservation. Aid declines sharply. Massive displacement leads to ungoverned spaces and survival strategies among abandoned populations. Refugees accumulate in the few areas where aid is accessible, creating bottlenecks and humanitarian flashpoints. Many intermediary actors have collapsed as crises are ignored. Only local actors continue to engage directly in support of communities, but due to resource constraints, this is largely voluntary. What we see and explore most in this scenario is a future where communities are left almost entirely to themselves to respond and support each other through episodes of crises and emergency. There is a large strain of sort of faith-based and mutual aid that exists as sort of the form of aid that is almost always there, even in the most desperate situations, even where today the formal systems and structure of the aid sector don't reach. We see how communities work together to support themselves. So in this scenario of the great unraveling, where do you see areas of innovation that are necessary to prioritize, to think about how the aid system itself could strive to be of use to communities as they are facing episodes of severe vulnerability? Just as you're responding to this, One of the things that we always stress when we're talking about these scenarios is that we never integrate the language of best case, worst case within this framework, because the best and worst case is often in the eye of the beholder. Rather, what we do is we encourage you to think about ways in which there are different challenges and different opportunities for effectiveness that exist in all four of these different futures. And the consideration that we have to have is how are we able to try and work most effectively in these different spaces? It's a question not of best and worst, but of adaptability. Here we have resilience and capacity coming forward again as one of the most important areas. But unlike on the empires of aid scenario, financing and resource flows has come back up into the top three, along with partnership models and legitimacy and trust flowing not far behind. The scenarios themselves are presented in great detail in the Future of Aid report. But there's another thing that we also gathered from the community as we were building it, which was a reflection on what are the kind of emergencies and crises to which we would need to be preparing to respond. And so I want to talk about that next. We developed within the report what we call a typology of crises using a triadic approach. One of the things that was very clear from the community that we were consulting as we were building out this study was that crises don't happen by any one cause. Rather, they are intersecting dimensions that create crises. One aspect of this is what we termed a destabilizer. These are broad, often transboundary forces such as climate change, but also extreme weather events, conflict, economic shocks, or pandemic, which can trigger a crisis. But a crisis can only occur in situations where there are other dynamics as well. Levels of community resilience were also defined to be critical in determining whether or not a destabilizer created a crisis. And this we look at in terms of the levels of access to resources and levels of structural vulnerability which exist within a community. For example, levels of poverty or particular exclusion. And the third element of whether or not a destabilizer created a crisis was a thinking on the aid system configuration. So how funding flows and delivery mechanisms and the timeliness and effectiveness of preparedness, anticipatory action, and response fundamentally influence the crisis outcomes. I think this quote from our colleague in Burundi really typifies why we think it's important to be thinking about crises. And I know that I'm in the right audience when I'm with START as we have this conversation. But when you reflect on this question of aid being felt as receive what I want you to eat today, but don't ask me about tomorrow, we do communities a huge disservice. As you all know, and I know that I am preaching to the choir when I say this, thinking about the long term is something that comes very naturally to communities. They are not only worried about tomorrow, they're worried about next week, next year, they're worried about their children, about the environment and their community as a whole. And forcing them to think only about the next day is often it undermines their ability to think about the way in which they structure their lives. So one of the things we wanted to stress as part of the Future of Aid study was to think more a little about these crises that we need to be prepared for and to try and invest in these systems as the START network already has in terms of anticipatory action and building up our capacity to help communities not have to suffer through the emergency themselves before they receive support. I don't want to go into these in too much detail, but what I wanted to just outline are these are an example of 7 of the different kinds of crises that came through when we asked people to think about the challenges that they face, the kind of humanitarian needs they thought were going to come to the forefront, and how they saw the responses changing. So this is brought together by many different questions asked through the Future of Aid process. And there are 7 crises here. Erosive crises, which are built from slow pressures. Weaponized crises, which can be a sudden shock, but critically, the response to that sudden shock is heavily politicized. Technocratic fallouts, which you're sort of looking more at the disruptions created by bureaucratic systems or automated system failures. Protracted collapse. I think that's very clear already. Persecution and disenfranchisement, so the imbalance of treatment within communities and formal systems being unwilling or unable to address that imbalance. Strategic abandonment, so the willful inaction or neglect of communities. This can be both at an international or at a national level. And ecosystemic crises, a critical event that spreads across systems, triggering cascading disruptions for communities themselves, particularly where there is low resilience within the existing system. So we have this list of crises outlined here, and just as a asking for your sort of gut reaction, which of these types of crises do you feel will occur most frequently over the coming 15 years? You can choose more than one, but we just wanted to hear a little bit from you when you think about the kind of crises that you believe that we as an aid system need to be prepared for to support communities through, and hopefully to act in anticipation of them so they don't have to suffer the responses of them. Which one of these do you think comes to the forefront? We can see here immediately a weaponized crisis being far out at the front, I think, already, which I think is a very apt example of what is in the news today and in the responses that we have. The situation in Gaza as a key example of this in this area, followed by ecosystemic crises and protracted collapse. I'm going to move us along quickly because I want to leave enough time for questions if you have any. But I just want to highlight some of the things when we ask people to think about challenges for the system, which is what influenced significantly the typology of crisis as well as the scenarios. They came out with these sort of broad buckets of ideas. Some of the ones that were most mentioned were the top two on the left here of climate change and environmental crises and funding shortages and donor fatigue, though many of these played a role in the reflections of what people felt that the aid system and them as aid actors would need to respond to. This has been a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of what is contained within the Future of Aid study. I wanted to leave you with a couple of reflections before I try and bridge into your next session. But when we thought about the conclusions of this study, the idea of the Future of Aid in 2040 is that it's divided into two phases. This first phase was very analytical, focused on this foresight report. And the outcomes of this sort of are captured in two papers, which have been published already. And what these really look at were the fact that without addressing the root causes of these vulnerabilities, communities remain trapped in cycles of crises. True transformation at a systems level, not in an ad hoc small way, requires collective action. It's not possible for any one actor to change the system alone. And I think Christina and Sanj had already stressed the importance of networks in their introduction, which is where this becomes so clear. Having these platforms and spaces to be able to consider and co-create together is vital. And finally, we are really encouraging actors to take the long view. Though funding cuts are currently the primary driver of many strategic reviews and organizational restructures of changes in priorities of the UN80 and humanitarian reset systems, we are really trying to encourage aid actors to think not just about how to increase efficiency in the short term, but rather ensure that decisions being taken today are building towards a more just and effective system in the future. If we have to suffer through the pain now of massive disruptions in terms of both staff and funding, of programs closing and priorities shifting, let's ensure that that pain has purpose and that the output at the end of it is not just a reduced system of what we had before, but rather a truly transformed system which is able to really live the values which we have been espousing for many decades. Policy papers aren't power shifts. This is one of my many favorite things that Habat Khalfan has said and articulated. And so this is what the phase two will really work to do next. So aid actors have agency. Everything I've presented today is intended to be a tool for us to use to be able to co-create this new system. And the scenarios we've defined, we're not constrained by these futures, but rather need to use this foresight analysis as a basis to move forward and make these decisions. And I think that's what part of some of the reflections of the agenda that you have today will outline. So what comes next for you in the next few days in thinking about assemblies? I want to encourage you to really think about the role of networks as you consider the changes that we face. What new forms of trust, legitimacy, and accountability need to be established? How are those built? What investments need to be made, and who leads and defines those? How do you coordinate effectively in fragmented and highly contested humanitarian spaces? We just saw that weaponized crises were some of the things that you all reflected on really needing to focus on. So how can we ensure that networks are prepared to operate within those environments? How can networks themselves be not only conduits, but also of information, but also spaces for innovation? As we said, collective action is absolutely critical. And without spaces to do that, it can be very hard to see how we will have a way forward. I'm going to leave this question open here. Given what we've reviewed this morning, all of the different inputs that we've had from the future of aid, the levers of innovation you identified, and the kind of futures we need to prepare for, how do you see the role of networks changing and evolving? While this is up here, you can also, if you would like, I think, ask questions. If there's any questions that you have or anything that you want me to address, you can use Slido, or potentially, I'm not sure if there's someone from Start in the chat, if we can use the chat as well. I'm happy either way. So if anyone has any questions, there are a couple on Slido loaded already, so I can start with those if that's helpful. But you can use either platform. So the first question on Slido that I see loaded is, how will the future of aid 2040 look like? Well, I think part of the challenge is that I don't believe anyone can answer that question concretely. One of the goals of using scenarios is the intention and ambition that I would never believe anyone who said that they could accurately predict what such a complex environment as the aid system would look like in 2040. So rather than trying to have that prediction of a future, what I would always encourage you to do is to think about the spectrum of uncertainty and try and understand that better. Try and understand where are the drivers of change and the levers of innovation that could shape and shift the system itself. So I think there's another point here around likelihood. Do you have any likelihood of the ranking of the 4 scenarios? I think there are in different contexts, different scenarios are more likely. So I think when we reflect back on the 2030 Future of Aid report, which you may remember was actually part of the Start Evolve process 10 years ago, within those scenarios, for a very long time, I felt like we were living within the overwhelmed scenario. But I think just as we were writing this report, we were sort of shifting into a different vision of that future. But I think what we have had, and I think my opinion is less relevant here, but the feedback we've had from more people is that many people feel like we are already living in many places within the Empires of Aid scenario that's outlined in the Future of Aid 2040 study. And so I think that's quite telling, that we have received that feedback quite significantly. And I think that there are, however, sort of as we said, different areas of the world will have different realities, even today, let alone in the future. So I think from where we are at this moment, I would say the feedback is that the aid on many paths scenario is the more dominant structure that we have. So I think that there is, I'm not sure if it's a question in the chat, but where we've outlined what are the collaboration perspectives for 2040. I'm not sure if I understand that question fully, but I think the drive of this is really to think about that. That's really the next question. So for us, the phase 2 of the Future of Aid study is all about working in a sequential way where we focus on building an aid system where each actor understands well its value proposition. And as a result, we're able to work in a way that's more complementary and less competitive. So the goal of the phase 2 study is to take this research forward, primarily first with local organizations to define how they would see successful responses to the different types of crises that we explored in each of these different kinds of futures, to consider what are some of the capacities that they would sort of want to have to be able to lead on responses, and then to take that forward with intermediary actors and consider how they can support and amplify those kind of responses, really to build on that local leadership and come in sort of as a supporting infrastructure where it's relevant to be able to build on that. And then to take that forward with the enabling actors and donors to consider how to incentivize moving in that direction. So the goal of the next phase is to sort of define how collaboration could be structured in 2040, different potential ways of doing that. And so I think that for us is a critically excited next phase within that view. I think there's one more question in the chat here. So it says that I know the research is very much the voice of affected populations, but I'm curious as to how much these outcomes are European-centric on its worldview, and if this had been conducted in North America, would there be a difference in the analysis? I mean, potentially, obviously, we as researchers have to be humble in understanding how our own perspectives can influence the research that we lead. One of the things we worked very hard to do within the Future of Aid study is ensure that there were no sort of analytical or intuitive leaps that were taken alone by the research team. So these were always validated with the broader Future of Aid community, from the identification of the drivers themselves to the selection of which ones were the most important. We then presented the framework before we'd even written the scenarios. We presented the framework of the scenarios with the different components and ideas. So we were challenged quite regularly on the sort of the outputs that were being designed. And then, of course, there was broad and wide draft review as it was being presented and finalized. So I think we tried as much as we could to ensure that we were being challenged in terms of the different inputs and outputs that were created. And as a result, we have also been heartened to hear from many other partners who participated in the study that they feel that the scenarios themselves and the report reflects very much what they're seeing on the ground. So I think we always have to be open to that criticism. I think it's very valid, and it's a very useful one for us to continually reflect on because it's important. But I think with this study, one of the things we did with the academic panel, who were foresighters from all over the world, shaped in designing the methodology, was to try as much as possible, and obviously you can never do it 100%, but as much as possible to ensure that the output was a representation of the community who participated in it, more than just the single person who wrote it. But I think it is I hadn't really unpacked fully whether or not, if it was written from DC, if there would be a different perspective in the analysis here. We were looking more to see how it could be reflective of the world overall rather than necessarily just between Europe and North America. I'm not sure if there are other questions, if anyone has any other reflections. I will just say we're really eager to have continued participation in phase 2. There will be a few opportunities where we will be doing global consultations at the outset and at the end. Phase 2 will be done a little bit more with in-person workshops, just given the nature of the discussions that need to happen. So those will be being run on many different continents to be able to allow and integrate those perspectives. But we are, as ever, eager with anyone who wants to follow along. Please do so. We would be very delighted to hear from you. You can follow along here on the website or on any of the social media. And with that, unless there are other questions, I can hand back to Christina.
Great. Thanks so much, Ailey. That was incredibly insightful. And, thanks to your team at IARAN, but also all of us, all of the 700, 800 people that participated in this study, because I think it really brings to life some of the scenarios we all see in our own communities, and some of the insights that we have in the spaces that we occupy. So, I think we're probably in a situation of empires of aid. That's at least what the impression that I got being in New York last week. But my money is on aid of many paths and network cooperation. And I was so heartened to see the poll at the very beginning of this that basically said that all of you think 63% of people on this call think that it is in network cooperation that we can find optimism. Obviously, we're a self-selecting group of network members here, but I take optimism and hope from that. So thanks very much. We're going to take a 15-minute break now. So at half past the hour, we will come back with our next session called Reframing Aid, Local and Regional Perspectives. It's a joint session with the Humanitarian Practice Network, so HPN. And we'll have guests from across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East talking about perspectives we don't normally hear when we're talking about the humanitarian reset. So please join us in 15 minutes, take a break, get a coffee, get some water, and join us for that discussion. Ailey, thanks again. And thanks for everyone who had the comments and questions in the chat and for participating in the Slido. See you in a few minutes. Take care.
Thank you all very much for your time.